Well, I'm pleased to say that some years ago, I'm a 1955 graduate of Yale Law School, and when I went there, it was considered the #1 law school in the nation. Recently, as an alumnus, I received a booklet from Yale Law School. Here's the booklet, and it's called Reading the Koran as a Law Book. It's from a lecture by Joseph Lowry, an associate professor from the University of Pennsylvania. And Mr. Lowry believes the Koran should be taken seriously as a book of laws. And this follows Yale's decision to create a Center for Islamic Law and Civilization after a Saudi businessman gave a $10 million donation to the law school. The dean says, and I quote, "Islamic law has a long and proud tradition which encompasses great intellectual achievements." He's got to be kidding. This is Yale Law School. They're in the tank to the Saudis. Well, anyhow, joining us now by satellite is Danny Slayman. Danny is an expert in Islamic law. Of course, he speaks fluent Arabic. And Danny, you read this booklet and you listened to the lecture by Professor Lowry. What is he trying to say?
Good morning, Pat. Basically, he's trying to allude that the commandments in the Quran are optional. He said, they're not specific, and we should basically take them as figuratively or symbolic and not literal. In fact, he called the traditional interpretations are as not true, and the Quran is highly mystical and spiritual. People are taking the laws in the Quran as too seriously as he basically described it.
Well, many of the Islamic laws don't even come from the Quran. And, how does Professor Lowry deal with that, the Hadith and the surahs?
Well, you're right, Pat. Basically, the Quran is the solid ground, is the foundation on which every Muslim follows. There's no such thing as figuratively or optional. They have to follow the commandments of the Quran. So I'm really not sure what he's basing it on. In fact, I read his book, and most of his descriptions were suggested. He's using the terms like suggested and great unknown and no real evidence and assume. So he's trying to draw a theory. He's trying to somehow dig out of it a way to show that the Quran has some peaceful verses, or you can get a law and we can follow it.
Well, look, you've got the Sharia stuff, which is their law code, and it has to do with the subjugation of women. It has to do with a husband having the privilege of beating his wife. It has to do with beheadings. It has to do with cutting off the hands of malefactors. How does he deal with all those things?
Well, in fact, he's trying to tell people, when you read the Quran, you have to take and see how the people received it in the early days of Islam. So his whole premise, basically, he said, when the Quran was delivered, it was immensely attractive. So let's see why this Quran was attractive, and let's follow it. So they must have a different understanding. They must have seen it from a different angle. In fact, Pat, if you study the history of Islam, you will find out that in the early days, when these peaceful verses were around 2/3 of the Quran was written, were not accepted by the people. In fact, they tried to kill him and he had to flee. And then when he became strong and he came back with the violent verses, which abrogated all the previous verses, then he forced these verses on people. So I'm not sure where Mr. Lowry is, what he's referring to. And you're right regarding the Sharia law. Basically what the Sharia law is, you take the commandments of the Quran and you read about the life of Muhammad, you put it together, and that's what Sharia law is.
Danny, I went to Yale Law School. It is a proud law, and when I went there, it was considered the #1 law school in the nation. Harvard would dispute it, but nevertheless, I thought it was #1 in the country. What is the danger of a law school using the Koran as a law book with a, quote, proud tradition? What do you say to that?
Again, I mean, the Quran is basically a commandment. It's a law. It's the principles in their understanding that Allah wants every single one to follow these words. So when Yale University is trying to basically endorse or apply the laws, then there will be no separation between the state and Islam. And basically, if we need to see an actual, practical Islamic state, look at the Islamic State in Iraq and in Syria. They're not drawing from their constitution, from anything else but from the Quran.
Well, Danny, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm appalled, frankly, but Yale, our news department questioned the officials at Yale Law School, and they said, quote, given our educational mission, we like to disseminate these kinds of materials as broadly as possible so that people can study and debate the important issues of the day. They put the imprimatur of Yale, and I hate to use the term they're in the tank to the Saudis, but if Saudi gives you $10 million, you better toe their line. You know, they talk about the golden rule, and he has the gold rules. Well, it's obviously they bought off Yale, and the series of these monographs, this isn't the only one they're passing out with that money, but it's amazing to see.
The thing is also, Pat, when you talk about studying and having, your mind enlightened by these things, to have students so unaware of the merit of the Constitution is just beyond belief in an academic place like that.
They all go together, and it shows how impressionable they are. But anyhow, as a former alum, I'm not a former alum, I'm an alum, I'm appalled. But they send this out to all the alumni. I got one. I didn't ask for it, but it comes in the mail, courtesy of Saudi Arabia via the Yale Law School.